Shortly after midnight on December 19, 1885, a resident of Forsyth, Missouri was awakened by a bright light shining into his window. When he looked to see what was causing it, he could see flames coming out of the windows of the Taney County courthouse. He ran outside and woke up his neighbors. Before long, a crowd was standing a safe distance from the fire and watching the building burn. One of the first men to arrive on the scene was County Clerk Thomas Layton. He made a desperate attempt to save anything from the fire. He smashed the window of a room that was on fire and managed to grab a book that happened to be lying near the window. The book was a record of all the land titles in Taney County. The only other man who was able to get anything out of the courthouse that night was County Treasurer Charles Groom. Groom rescued a good portion of Taney County's tax records, but neither man congratulated the other for his efforts. Everything else was destroyed as the entire courthouse burned to the ground. Immediately, conspiracy theories and accusations of arson started to fly. The large and powerful vigilante group, known as the Baldknobbers, blamed the fire on their enemies, like former Sheriff John Mosley, County Clerk Thomas Layton, and others. The vigilantes believed their opponents had been committing financial crimes and had taken the drastic step of burning down the courthouse to destroy the records of those crimes. Those who opposed the Baldknobbers figured the vigilantes had burned down the courthouse to destroy all records of land titles. If there were no records of who owned the land, the vigilantes could more easily push people off their land. But the land titles had been saved by County Clerk Thomas Layton. It was 5 days before Christmas, 1885, and everyone was on edge. In Taney County over the past 8 months, saloon owner James Everett had been killed by Al Layton, a cousin of County Clerk Thomas Layton. Al Layton was acquitted at trial, which did not sit well with many people in Taney County. Amos Ring had been killed by his stepson. The stepson's trial was moved out of the county, and the son was eventually acquitted. The notorious Taylor brothers, Frank and Tubal, had vandalized a store and shot the owner and his wife. Frank had done most of the damage, but Tubal was there too. During that streak of violence, Nathaniel Kinney formed the Baldknobbers, and the group's first official act of business was to hang Frank and Tubal Taylor. That could have been viewed as righteous, but the vigilantes quickly began to abuse their power. They went after anyone whom they perceived had slighted them or whose land they coveted. In short order, the vigilantes were as bad as the criminals. In response, a slow-moving rebellion started. A few families refused to show allegiance to the Baldknobbers and went so far as to call them out on their hypocrisy. The earliest of note were the Mercer brothers and the Cogburn family. Andrew Cogburn wrote songs that made fun of Nathaniel Kinney and the Baldknobbers, and the Cogburns reveled in singing them to show their disdain. The Cogburns and others also dared to make fun of Kinney at church sermons and Sunday school lessons. The Mercer brothers, Henry and Ephraim, must have been vocal at church services also, because in September 1885, local authorities issued an arrest warrant for the brothers on the charge of disturbing public worship. When Deputy Sheriff Arthur Kissy, a Baldknobber, tried to arrest Henry Mercer, Henry tried to shoot the deputy. Deputy Kissy ended up killing Henry Mercer, which caused the growing anti-Baldknobber faction to place Henry's brother in a kind of protective custody. Next up in the sights of the Baldknobbers were William Taylor, brother of Frank and Tubal, and Andrew Cogburn. And as was becoming the norm for the vigilante group, there was plenty of collateral damage. From Black Barrel Media, this is Legends of the Old West. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer, and this season we're telling the story of Missouri's vigilante wars, which were instigated by a terrifying group called the Baldknobbers. This is Episode 2, Murder and Mayhem. . Francis and Matilda Taylor were among the first people to flee Taney County in 1885, after the Baldknobbers hanged their sons Frank and Tubal from an oak tree. The parents moved their surviving children to Marionville, about 50 miles northwest in Lawrence County. In Marionville, their 25-year-old son William Taylor enrolled in college and taught Sunday school. On February 24, 1886, William hired McKendry Dimmick to take him on a short trip to Taney County. McKendry, who was better known as Mac, was 19 and was intellectually disabled. Mac owned a horse, a buggy, and a wagon, so William Taylor offered him a little cash to help him get some lumber and other items from his family's former homestead. 3 days later, Taylor returned to Marionville with the horse, the buggy, the wagon, and the lumber, but without McKendry. It's not clear who questioned Taylor at this early stage, but at least one neighbor, and presumably Dimmick's family, wondered where Mac was. Taylor either showed them or told them he had a bill of sale for the horse, the buggy, and the wagon. He acknowledged that he wrote the text, but claimed that Mac had signed it. Allegedly, Mac sold everything to Taylor for $60 in cash and a promissory note for another $60. Taylor claimed he and Mac parted ways at a place called Camp Spring in Taney County. Taylor said Mac was headed to Springfield, Missouri, and then Mac planned to take a train to Illinois to see his mother. Plenty of people were suspicious about Taylor's story, but no one investigated the matter. Until Mac's mother in Illinois grew anxious when she didn't see him or hear from him. She wrote to Deputy Sheriff Stafford in Marionville and asked him to find her son. Stafford set out for Taney County. He retraced the route Taylor and Dimmick had supposedly used. When he got to a town about 20 miles northwest of Forsyth, he learned that a body matching the description of Dimmick had been found 3 days before. Apparently, it was still lying in the spot where two boys had discovered it while hunting. Sure enough, Stafford found the body just inside the Taney County line. There was a bullet hole in the young man's head, and the body had been dragged down a hill and thrown into a hollow. The lawmen brought the body back to Marionville, where someone identified the remains of the unfortunate victim as McKendry Dimmick. Deputy Sheriff then filed murder charges against William Taylor. On March 30th, 1886, authorities in Taney County issued an arrest warrant for William Taylor. Not surprisingly, William Taylor did not want to go back to Taney County, the home of the vigilante group that had hanged his two brothers. Taylor was suspected of murdering a disabled young man. He probably wouldn't last a day in the Taney County jail. Taylor appealed to the authorities in his own county of Lawrence to send him to Greene County Jail in Springfield. Greene County officials agreed with Taylor and granted his request. Taylor was arrested and sent to jail in Greene County until the next term of the circuit court, which was slated for the next month. And while William Taylor sat in jail and hoped he was safe from the vigilantes, the Baldknobbers were pursuing their second major grievance. A confrontation was brewing between the leader of the Baldknobbers, Nathaniel Kinney, and his nemesis, Andrew Cogburn. The clash between the two was so intense it caused the state of Missouri to intervene. The previous summer in 1885, Andrew Cogburn and some of his family allegedly mocked Nathaniel Kinney during religious services. Kinney led regular Bible study lessons and was the president of the Sunday school for his local church. One day, parishioners arrived for the Bible study lesson and discovered a miniature coffin tacked to the door of the church. Inside the church, there was a sign with a skull and crossbones on it. Both displays were meant to disrespect or even threaten Nathaniel Kinney. No one expressly took credit for the actions, but the Cogburns didn't deny it either. Andrew Cogburn was well known for writing ballads that he and his friends loved to sing to annoy the vigilantes. The songs mocked the group for its pride, greed, and abuses of power. In particular, The songs highlighted the hypocrisy of Nathaniel Kinney. One resident of Taney County later recalled that after that day in church, Kinney and the Cogburns were like tigers. They eyed each other warily and guarded against a sneak attack. But around the same time William Taylor allegedly murdered McKendry Dimmick, Nathaniel Kinney got the drop on Andrew Cogburn. In the version of events that was told by the Baldknobbers, Kinney's Sunday school met at the Oak Grove Schoolhouse near Kinney's hometown of Kirbyville. On February 28, 1886, Kinney took his young son Paul to the schoolhouse to conduct the lesson. Before Kinney arrived, one of his friends, most likely Deputy Sheriff Galba Branson, noticed Andrew Cogburn and his friend, Samuel Snap, were also there. The deputy ran to warn the Baldknobber chieftain to take precautions in case Cogburn and Snap meant him harm. Kinney holstered his revolver and headed toward the school. When Kinney and his son arrived, they tied their horses about 100 feet from the schoolhouse door. They cautiously approached on foot, and Paul later told a friend that his father stayed out in front to protect him. There were several people in the schoolhouse who were waiting for the meeting to start, but as Kinney and his son approached the building, Kinney saw the shapes of two men loitering outside the door. According to Paul, it seemed at the time like a deliberate attempt to ambush his father. Nathaniel stopped, drew his revolver, and called out to the two dark shapes to raise their hands and step into the light. According to the story, Andrew Cogburn walked forward. He raised his left hand, but with his right, he attempted to draw his revolver. Kinney drew and fired, and shot Cogburn once in the chest. Cogburn pitched backward onto the ground. As Cogburn lay dying, Kinney leveled his gun at Sam Snap. He asked Snap what he planned to do. Snap replied that he had no weapon and would do nothing. Kinney told him to go into the schoolhouse and wait for the authorities to arrive. A deputy sheriff took Kinney into custody. An inquest was held the following morning that declared the killing a justifiable homicide and cleared Kinney of all charges. Notably, Kinney and several of his supporters showed up at the hearing heavily armed. Presumably, they expected retaliation from the Cogburn family. Kinney carried a revolver and a double-barrel shotgun, even though he was still officially under arrest. The coroner's jury examined only one witness, presumably someone who was inside the schoolhouse at the time of the shooting and therefore didn't see it. Paul Kinney and Sam Snap were the only two people who saw the shooting, and neither were asked to testify. Not surprisingly, when Sam Snap talked about the killing, even though he didn't testify at the formal hearing, he told a very different story. According to Sam Snap, he and Andrew Cogburn went to the schoolhouse to simply attend the Sunday school lesson. Given the Cogburn family history with Kinney, it seems reasonable to assume that the two young men might not have meant any physical harm, but they were certainly there to tease or otherwise harass Kinney. In Sam Snap's version, Andrew Cogburn did not have a weapon, so he never tried to draw one. When Kinney shot Cogburn, the younger man had both hands raised, and it was obvious there was no weapon in them. After the shooting, Kinney ordered Snap into the schoolhouse, where other worshippers had been waiting during the confrontation. Baldknobbers kept the doors to the building closed and didn't let anyone in or out for 90 minutes. When they finally allowed the worshippers to leave, Snap noticed a member of the vigilante group by Cogburn's body. Snap said the man was going through the pockets of Andrew Cogburn, probably to steal money or plant a weapon or both. Lastly, Snap said that no one asked him to testify before the coroner's jury, insinuating that Kinney's faction did not want the truth of the matter to be known. What really happened in those minutes is lost to perspective and history. Tensions in Taney County were so high at the time that everyone had a hair trigger. Cogburn and Snap had a history of being obnoxious, and were probably there to harass Kinney but not hurt him. For his part, Kinney was a killer, but he also considered himself the leader of law and order in Taney County. He did not believe he was the kind of person who would murder an innocent young man in cold blood. He may have thought he or his son were in danger. On the whole, the context and the motive became irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the leader of the Vigilantes had shot and killed a young man who was a vocal opponent of the Vigilantes. The killing served to harden the positions of both the Baldknobbers and a growing faction of opposition. On March 1, 1886, the day after Andrew Cogburn's death, a group of around 40 people who opposed the Baldknobbers met in the town of Forsyth. They drafted and signed a petition to the governor of Missouri that asked him to intervene on their behalf and help stop the Vigilantes' illegal crusade for justice. Toward that effort, the petitioners wanted official permission to establish their own anti-Baldknobber militia in Taney County. They also wanted weapons to protect themselves against the Baldknobbers. The participants at the meeting appointed 3 men to carry their petition to the governor in Jefferson City. In the meantime, they started arming themselves with whatever weapons they could acquire and drawing up bylaws for their new militia. Of course, the following day, Kinney and several of his followers appeared in Forsyth and made public threats against those who planned to fight them. Kinney and other Baldknobbers rode around town and told anyone they encountered that they knew exactly which men had been at that meeting, and they vowed revenge. Faced with the intimidation, 2 anti-Baldknobbers backed out of the trip to Jefferson City. One man, J.J. Reynolds, decided he would risk it. On March 1st or March 2nd, 1886, Reynolds set out on the 180-mile trip to the state capitol. He hand-delivered the petition to the governor on March 5th. Despite Reynolds' plea for help, Governor John Marmaduke only gave him vague assurances that he would intervene. Marmaduke was in a tough spot. His political supporters tended to lean toward the anti-Baldknobber side, the side of Mr. Reynolds. But if the governor intervened on their behalf, he risked a new wave of bloodshed by the Vigilantes. On top of that, many of the Baldknobbers held elected positions, which gave the group a kind of semi-legitimate status, even if their actions weren't legal. So, the governor did what all smart politicians do. He sent someone else to handle it. On April 8, 1886, Adjutant General James Jameson arrived in Forsyth. The next day, Jameson held a summit with Kinney and several leaders of both factions. Around 500 people attended. Jameson gave them an ultimatum. They could stop fighting, or he could send a militia down to do it for them, and he would charge Taney County for the expense. He would also bring investigators and make sure everybody who deserved it would face trial for murder and mayhem. Kinney didn't want to disband, but more moderate members of his group prevailed, and Kinney agreed he would abide by the peace agreement. The anti-Baldknobber leaders decided they would too, and for a few weeks, the accord held up. But as Kinney soon found out, some of his followers had gotten a taste of power, anger, and vengeance, and they wanted more. At first, Jameson's visit seemed to have resolved the problem. A moderate faction of the Baldknobbers agreed to dismantle the organization. Leaders of the anti-Baldknobbers, including former Sheriff John Mosley, County Clerk Thomas Layton, and J.J. Reynolds, agreed to the truce. For the most part, anti-Baldknobbers believed peace would return so long as the Vigilantes kept their promise to disband their organization. On April 10th, it seemed like Jameson had secured a peace agreement. But in Jameson's private correspondence with the governor, he was skeptical of how effective he had been. Based on interviews with people for and against the group, he wasn't sure that Nathaniel Kinney would willingly tell his group to dissolve. And even if Kinney did, townspeople were concerned that he had lost control over his most ardent followers. After Jameson left on April 13th, some Baldknobbers continued to harass and intimidate Taney County residents. They continued to ride up to homes at night with torches, threatening owners for whatever reason, and hurling insults and warnings to those they perceived as their enemies. On the evening of May 1st, 1886, someone shot a horse that belonged to County Clerk Thomas Layton and set fire to a fence on his property. About half of it burned down before the neighbors put it out. The following week, people who were thought to be Baldknobbers burned down the home of a physician. The vigilantes continued their policy of forced evictions. According to anti-Baldknobber J.J. Reynolds, they forced 2 men off their homesteads and expelled a widow with her small children. On May 9th, the bloodshed resumed. Sam Snap, whose friend Andrew Cogburn had been killed by Nathaniel Kinney, had been friends with a man named Washington Middleton. Middleton tried to join the local chapter of a popular agricultural society. Snap, who already belonged to the group, blocked Middleton's membership because of the role Middleton had taken in the Baldknobbers. That role was primarily as Nathaniel Kinney's bodyguard. Middleton never forgave Snap for the slight. On May 9th, witnesses saw and heard Middleton and Snap arguing. Snap had been drinking, and he made the fateful error of singing one of Andrew Cogburn's anti-vigilante songs to Middleton. Middleton returned the insults, calling Snap, among other things, a damn bushwhacker. In that day and time, the insult was a bad one. At 30 years old, Snap was far too young to have fought in the Civil War alongside men like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, who became known as Missouri Bushwhackers. But Middleton's comment still stung. Later that day, for some reason, the 2 men met up in front of the general store in Kirbyville. Middleton pulled his gun and began firing. Snap tried to retreat, but Middleton scored 3 hits. Sam Snap fell down dead in the street. The killing set off a firestorm of complaints to the governor's office. All of them referenced the murder as proof that the vigilantes had broken their promise to keep the peace. The complaints pointed out that Sam Snap was already a widower, and his death made orphans of his 5 small children. And the complaints reminded the governor that Snap had been an eyewitness to Kinney's shooting of Andrew Cogburn. It was possible that the Baldknobbers had organized Snap's murder to silence him. Though, to be fair, the case against Kinney had finished 2 months earlier, and Kinney had been cleared of all wrongdoing. There was little reason to silence a witness who had never testified and couldn't do anything to hurt Kinney now. In reality, Snap's killing was the result of bad blood between a pro-vigilante and an anti-vigilante, and some extra bad history thrown in the mix. 5 months later, in October, an issue that simmered in the background flared up. William Taylor finally went to trial for the murder of McKendry Dimmick. William Taylor's trial was supposed to have happened back in April. Around the same time, Adjutant General James Jameson traveled to Taney County to broker a peace deal. But Taylor secured a series of continuances, and the trial finally happened in October. Understandably, a lot of anti-Baldknobbers feared the vigilantes would lynch Taylor like they had lynched his 2 brothers the previous year. But the Baldknobbers pledged to allow Taylor to have a fair and impartial trial. The county prosecutor assured Adjutant General Jameson that he would keep Taylor safe. In addition, the prosecutor believed the vigilantes had no reason to lynch Taylor because the case against Taylor was strong, and he would definitely be convicted. The case was so strong, in fact, that one of the vigilantes, an attorney, agreed to represent Taylor in court. The lawyer thought the trial was just a formality, and it would end with a quick and obvious conviction. And then, the jury found Taylor not guilty. Probably more surprising than the verdict was that the vigilantes did not attack Taylor. They left him alone, and he wisely moved out of southern Missouri. Almost exactly a year later, in October 1887, in another surprise twist, a jury found George Middleton guilty of murdering Sam Snap. Middleton may have been the most shocked, because it was Baldknobbers in the county government who likely helped get Nathaniel Kinney acquitted. Middleton expected the same courtesy, but he didn't get it. He was sentenced to 40 years in the state prison in Springfield, but he never served a day of it. A few days after his sentencing, Middleton escaped from the county jail in Forsyth and fled to Arkansas. Some Baldknobbers hinted that they'd helped him escape, but there was no proof to back up the claim. Middleton went on the run for 8 months. At some point, a posse caught up with him, but Middleton killed the leader of the posse and escaped again. Finally, a detective found him at a 4th of July picnic in Newton County. When Middleton resisted arrest, the detective shot and killed him. Middleton's death was welcome news for Sam Snap's family, and for the most part, it was welcome news for Taney County. Snap's murder signaled a pause in the vigilante-related violence for the time being, and Middleton's death seemed to balance the scales and calm the waters of discontent. But that wasn't the only reason the bloodshed paused. In November 1886, shortly after Middleton went on the run, local elections resulted in 3 Baldknobbers attaining the important positions of sheriff, county clerk, and coroner. So, the Baldknobbers effectively controlled the county through their legitimate power in local government, and their desire for vigilante tactics lost some of its appeal. Ironically, the only vigilante candidate who did not win his race was Nathaniel Kinney, who lost a second bid for state representative. The anti-Baldknobbers were still angry and anxious about their enemy's grip on power, but they had no means to avenge the wrongs they had suffered. With the court cases settled, for better or worse, and the election in the books, an uneasy peace settled over Taney County. But in nearby Douglas County, the bloodshed was just getting started, and it was the vigilantes of Douglas County who would create the most frightening and lasting image of the Baldknobbers. Soon after Nathaniel Kinney and his cohorts founded the Baldknobbers in Taney County in April 1885, new chapters of the group began sprouting up in other parts of southwest Missouri. During the summer of 1885, a farmer named Joseph Walker invited Kinney to help him establish a new chapter of the organization in Douglas County, north of Taney County. Then, Joseph's brother David started a new chapter in Christian County, right next to Douglas County. The 3 counties shared borders and formed a triangle of vigilante power. The Baldknobbers in Christian and Douglas didn't meet on treeless hills because that topography didn't exist. And unlike the founders in Taney County, the members in Christian and Douglas counties hid their faces behind terrifying masks. To make the masks, members typically used black calico that covered the whole head and face, with holes cut out for eyes and a mouth. They stitched the edges of the holes with red thread, which created a buttonhole appearance. On the top, they added cloth cones that resembled horns. Lastly, they drew circles of white paint around the face holes to give the mask a ghostly aspect. The masks made the men who wore them look like hideous, devilish creatures, which was their goal. On horseback, especially at night with glowing torches, the effect was ghastly. The members of the original organization in Taney County had no reason to wear masks. Their members essentially controlled the county government. But in the 2 northern counties, it was a different story. Evidence indicates that only a few held any office at all, and the vigilantes in Christian and Douglas counties had slightly different beliefs. Very generally speaking, they didn't want economic progress or new homesteaders in their counties. They wanted to keep the population down and keep farming as the main way of life. And they spent more time harassing people for religious or moral reasons than for law and order reasons. In the summer of 1886, the Baldknobbers in the northern counties started a campaign of night riding and intimidation. First, it started with whippings. Among the first victims was Edwin Helms. On the evening of July 30th, David Walker and a dozen Baldknobbers rode up to the homestead of Helms in the eastern part of Christian County. Helms was 34 years old, with a wife and 6 children, and had settled there the previous year. The vigilantes broke into Helms's home, dragged him outside, and put a rope around his neck. They whipped him until he bled profusely and warned him to leave the county. They also whipped Green Walker, who was no relation to Joseph and David Walker. Green was a polygamist. In August 1886, David Walker and about 19 others seized Green from his house. They beat the hell out of him with hickory switches and told him to stop living with multiple women. Green didn't, and in October, a party of night riders came back and again beat him to within an inch of his life. That time, he took the hint and moved away. In November of 1886, a Baldknobber captain led a band of armed and masked men to the residence of Christian County homesteader Perry Hirsch. They called him out of his house and ordered him to leave within 30 days, or they would hang him. Wisely, Hirsch moved. In neighboring Douglas County, the vigilante group formed by Joseph Walker was doing the same thing. In November 1886, a Baldknobber named John Denny led a party of night riders to the home of Hugh Ratliff, a simple homesteader. The men broke down the door and burst into the house, where Ratliff slept with his wife and their baby. Their 15-year-old daughter slept nearby. Ratliff struggled with the attackers as several Baldknobbers tried to pull a noose around his neck and 4 others tried to pull him out of his bed. While Ratliff fought back, his wife tried to help her husband while cradling her baby in one arm. In the chaos, the wife's arm got crushed between the bed and the knees of a Baldknobber. Finally, the vigilantes wrestled Ratliff out of the house at gunpoint. They took him to the stump of an old tree where they held him down and whipped him. Ratliff begged them to stop while also asking what he could have possibly done to deserve the treatment. It turned out Ratliff had loaned money to another homesteader to help him set up in the area, and the Baldknobbers were angry at more county land going to an outsider. They told Ratliff to mind his own business and never speak of the whipping, or they'd come back with a lot more than a warning. At the end of 1886, federal authorities charged 10 vigilantes with intimidating Ratliff and the other homesteader and forcing them out of the county. And it would be logical to think that the introduction of federal lawmen to Christian and Douglas counties would end the savagery. Instead, the savagery intensified until it included murder. Next time on Legends of the Old West, vigilante leader David Walker organizes the murders of 2 adversaries and almost kills their wives and children in the process. The vigilante violence in southern Missouri hits its peak and then leads to the downfall of the Baldknobbers once and for all. That's next week on the final episode of the Vigilante series here on Legends of the Old West. Members of our Black Barrel Plus program don't have to wait week to week to receive new episodes. They receive the entire season to binge all at once with no commercials, and they also receive exclusive bonus episodes. Sign up now through the link in the show notes or on our website, blackbarrelmedia.com. This series was researched and written by Julia Bricklin. Original music by Rob Valier. I'm your host and producer, Chris Wimmer. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Check out our website, blackbarrelmedia.com, for more details, and join us on social media. We're at Old West Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And all of our episodes are on YouTube. Just search for Legends of the Old West Podcast. Thanks for listening.